And welcome to RealAg Live, everybody. I'm your host, Shaun Haney, also founder of RealAgriculture.com and host of RealAg Radio that you can hear every day on Rural Radio 147 on Sirius XM at 4:30 Eastern. So today on RealAg Live, this is actually the first time on RealAg Live since we started doing these broadcasts about just over a month ago that we're going to talk the weather. So today, whether you're watching on YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook, you can get your questions in. Just enter them in the comment box, and we'll be sure to get to as many as we possibly can, no matter where you're farming in Canada or even in the United States, if you please. So today's guest is Drew Lerner of World Weather Inc. He is based out of Kansas City, and he is no stranger to many of us in Canada. He provides fantastic forecasts all the time. I know he's got a lot of subscribers here in Canada. So, Drew, how's it going?
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah, it's summertime down here in the middle of the U.S., and it's hot, I might tell you.
Okay, so when you say hot, how hot?
Well, we're probably we're running mostly in the lower 30s right now, Celsius, or the middle 80s Fahrenheit.
Oh,
so
that's nice.
It's very similar to what's been happening here recently in parts of southern Manitoba and southeastern Saskatchewan. So you guys can all relate.
How's the humidity? Is that because I've been to Kansas City in the summertime and it can be humid.
Yeah, that can be brutal sometimes, but it's not too bad so far this year. We haven't had a lot of rain recently, so it's been all right.
Yeah,
can't complain too much.
People in Alabama are like, "I'll show you humidity."
yeah, no kidding. Now that's suffering the big time.
I remember one time flying to North Carolina, into Asheville, North Carolina in July. And I remember getting off the plane onto the tarmac, and it was just like this wall that hit me, prairie farm kid, dry heat. It's just like, wow, that is humidity. That weighs on your chest.
I got to tell you that it weighs on everyone down there as well. It's just tough, period. You think you get used to it, but it's nasty. It is. You can literally cut it with a knife, I think.
Well, Drew, every year it's different, right? We always have these references in weather to, it feels a little bit like this year or that year. How is this year lining up? Does it right now, based on the conditions we've had in the first half of the year, is there a year that this feels like?
Oh, absolutely. I think that this has been very similar to one that occurred back in 40 years ago, 1966, believe it or not.
Oh.
I know that probably a lot of us can't remember that far back in time. I know that I have to look it up, but it was very similar. All these shots of cold air across the Canadian prairies down into the north central parts of the U.S. plains. And the rain events as they have occurred, as well as the snow, all worked out very similarly to that of 1966. And even in the States, there's been a lot of similarity. And it's actually been quite amazing. The late season cool snaps have all been associated with that, which occurred back in that time. And the reason why it's so interesting is because the 1960s was a much colder decade than anything we have seen around these parts in the last 20 years or so. So it's kind of interesting to see that we can still generate some fairly chilly air across at least Canada. The U.S., of course, was very warm over the winter, but interesting parallel.
Huh. Okay. So the top song in 1966, I just looked it up for you. The Ballad of the Green Berets by Sergeant Barry Sadler. Cherish by the Association. I don't remember any of these. I gotta be honest with you, Drew. Also, number 3 was You're My Soul and Inspiration, the Righteous Brothers. Well, I know the Righteous Brothers.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Good song. That takes me back. You got to have that in the background playing here. Is what you gotta do.
I need to get a music underbed. So how did 1966 finish off, if that's the year? What can we look forward to?
A drier bias actually comes in late in the year, but we have an active weather pattern that stays with us through a large part of the summer in the prairies. Now, the U.S. will end up with ridginess, and that's expected to evolve as we get out over these next few weeks, mostly in July. The ridge will end up building up. It'll probably poke its head up above the Canada border, and we'll end up seeing some heat and dryness occurring, unfortunately, in the same area that's been struggling here for a little while in the eastern prairies. Later, the ridge will try to retrograde or shift back to the west, and as it does that, we'll probably dry down Alberta. Yay,
Oh,
right? I mean, been
finally.
yeah, it'll be a chance to finally turn the corner there. Alberta's just what a terrible 4 year period this has been, but certainly this spring and early summer has been just awful, awful, too wet.
Well, but to be fair though, you got to cut the province not really in half, but the bottom part of southern Alberta, this is welcome rain. We could even take some more actually if the heat will come. It's really like, I don't know, would you say Calgary North or Red Deer North, for sure Edmonton and into the Peace
Yeah, oh
River
yeah,
region, where it just like they just need some sunshine.
yeah, absolutely. The worst area that I can tell right now is really Lloydminster to Edmonton, north of that line, and then from Edmonton to Red Deer and west. So kind of an L shape. Those are the areas that have really taken it on the chin, and I don't believe they got all the field work done up in the north part of the province. They had
Yeah.
some leftover crop they had to get out before they could even get into the fields to do any planting, and they got that taken care of. And then they got about 2/3 of the way through the planting season and ended up, having to stop because it was just too darn wet. So we have some abandonment out there, most definitely. You're absolutely right. I was really thinking about the northern and western part of the province where we've had 3 years of harvest delays in the autumn. Their summers weren't too bad, but the autumn, oh my gosh, just we had to leave crop in the field every one of those years.
So actually, it was over the weekend. Like Manitoba's still getting frost warnings. That
Oh, yes.
What's going on there?
Yes. What's that part of that 66 scenario that I was talking about? But yeah, it was frost across a part of the province. It even frosted and froze a little bit in Ontario this past weekend, too. And so a little bit of crop injury. Yeah, but this is all coming from that northwest flow pattern that's been with us forever, it seems like. And we keep getting these shots of cold air coming southward. Now, one of the interesting things about this pattern is that it has occurred routinely. We can almost go back to lasted mid-December and count 60 days forward from each of all the way through that period. And every time we get to the middle of each month, we find ourselves with a significant cold surge taking place. And this was one of the things that we used as a predictor for the May freezes because we were repeating this pattern on a regular basis. I think the frost and freeze that we just had this past weekend was probably a little leftover of that cycle. It really didn't match real well, but it was an obvious sign that the pattern had not totally abated from the region. Very interesting. Very interesting.
And does that carry through, like in the coming months as well? Like say August 15th. Is this something we should be watching out for?
Well, there's a guy here in Kansas City named Gary Lezak, and he has what he calls the Lezak recurring cycles, LRC, and he bases it on this same thing that I'm talking about. And he claims that this pattern, when it occurs, tends to get perpetuated all the way through into the early autumn. I'm not sure that I've seen that happen very often. It can be there. It just depends on what other kind of weather patterns are prevailing at the time. And the more of this kind of pattern that we see repeated without a big ridge of high pressure coming along, yeah, you could get some of that. But I don't want you scaring everybody talking about frost and freezes when August rolls around here, because that's not where I'm going. We
Yeah.
could see some shots of cool air, most definitely. And actually, those shots of cool air that will come will be welcome because we're going to have that ridge of high pressure around, and will bring in an opportunity to cause a contrast in air mass temperatures, which will help to generate some rain. And that will help to perpetuate a relatively good summer, maybe across the prairies. And I say maybe because I'm a little concerned about the ridge that's supposed to build up in July across the U.S. plains and western Corn Belt. That ridge could end up being a rather strong one, and it might be difficult for the cool air to beat it down. And so we could end up with a little bit more of a drier flavor as we go forward through the heart of summer. And so that's something we're worrying about and watching real closely. But yeah, if you keep the ridge relatively tame, we could get some shots of cool air, but they're not going to bring frost and freezes. They'll bring rain.
What about Ontario? What are the things on your mind there?
Ontario is coming out of a pretty rough year as well. A lot of wet weather occurred there too, and Had a little slow start to the spring. It got kind of chilly there for a while, a lot of snow and a
Yeah.
lot of rain that occurred. So, but the conditions there have improved. Like I said, though, this past weekend there was a little frost and freeze across parts of eastern Ontario and the southern part of Quebec. And so that didn't go over real well. There wasn't a lot of damage, but maybe a little bit in some areas. But I think that is the last of the bad news for them. I think the weather is going to settle down a little bit, and we'll get kind of a little bit less frequent, less substantial amount of rainfall and a better mix of weather. So we'll kind of alternate back and forth a little bit, see a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and it'll end up averaging out pretty well. So I think they'll have a better year too. Kind of like Alberta on the other extreme. We'll probably see a little less of a stormy finish to the season for them too.
Well, in 1966, Baltimore won the Major League Baseball title, the World Series. That's not going to happen here in 2020. And Montreal won the Stanley Cup. Well, there's no way that's happening because we all know that Calgary's going to win. Okay, we have a question here from Lindsay Smith. Lindsay says, can Drew tell me when my window for second cut hay will be? Thanks. I need 5 to 6 dry days in a row with no rain, low humidity, and a gentle breeze. Lindsay, of course, is in Ottawa, Drew.
Oh. Well, I think probably the situation there, goodness, I have to think back here a little bit. As we go through the latter part of this month, we'll probably see a little bit of an opportunity for some drier weather to evolve. Right now, though, we're breaking down the ridge in the middle of North America. So as we break that down, it's going to open the door for a more active weather pattern. But we're hoping and thinking that most of that active weather is going to be in the U.S., and so there'll be less precipitation in the eastern part of Canada, and hopefully that will turn out to be a favorable environment for getting out there and doing some work. I'm going to say that maybe over this next week and a half, there will be a better stretch of drier weather in that area. The temperatures will be a little bit mildish, but I think it'll turn out to be favorable. So patience. Keep a close eye on your local forecast, and you'll be able to see that there's going to be a break in the pattern. You will be able to get back into those fields.
Lindsay mentioned gentle breeze, and I'll tell you what. One thing we have not had is a gentle breeze in parts of the prairies and even Ontario. We had a conversation yesterday on RealAg Radio where even Ontario is talking about there's just wind they're not used to. I'm in Lethbridge, Alberta, so it never stops blowing. Have we had an increased amount of wind across Canada this year? And if so, why?
Yeah, we have definitely had more wind across the prairies in particular. Now, Ontario, we can probably find a good excuse for it, and it hasn't been nearly as persistent. But boy, in Saskatchewan and in southern Alberta, even parts of Manitoba, it definitely has been greater than usual. And this is one of the things that bothers me greatly about our outlook. I've been one of those that have said that we'll have well-timed rainfall over the summer, but the rule that I have is when we have persistent wind like that just doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's usually associated with a drought, unfortunately. Now, I can remember back in 1980 here in Kansas City, where we started the spring season just like what's happening in the prairies, where you get up in the morning and the wind's just already blowing, and it just blows all day long. And as time goes along, you take moisture out of the soil, and you start, getting a little bit less moisture in the air because the soil's not feeding back. And then you keep the wind blowing, and eventually you exhaust your moisture sources. If the Gulf of Mexico gets closed off and you can't throw moisture up that way, you end up perpetuating this and really creating some issues with dryness. Now, if you think back to what's been happening this spring, you will remember that the strong winds in the prairies has also often occurred with very low humidity, and that's not a good sign. We have removed moisture from Montana, eastern Montana, the western Dakotas, portions of south central through east central and southeastern Saskatchewan, and we're doing the same now in portions of Manitoba. That's a large area of real estate that's trending drier and being subjected to a lot of wind and low humidity. That is not a good sign. We're also seeing the same kind of thing occurring in the southern U.S. plains across the area from southwest Kansas and southeast Colorado all the way down through west Texas And that area has already been dry and is critically dry and will stay that way. So now we're talking about an area from the northeast part of Mexico all the way up into the prairies that has a dry bias. When we develop this ridge of high pressure in July, if we haven't done a better job to relieve some of this moisture deficit in the soil, I'm a little bit concerned that we could see a more broad-based bout of dryness that could be threatening to a lot of agriculture. So this wind that we're talking about, I think, is symptomatic of something much bigger. Normally, when you get a lot of wind, there's a big low pressure system on one side of the wind and a big high pressure system on the other, and it's just the wind going back and forth. But we've had wind on days when there hasn't been any big high or low pressure system, and that worries me.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned Colorado and parts of Kansas. I saw in the crop condition report the USDA put out yesterday. Like some of that winter wheat in Colorado, not in the best shape. It's like I think 47% fair. So lack of moisture having an impact for sure. Jim Hale, who farms out in Lancer, Saskatchewan, he's in the Palliser Triangle. He says fall forecast for southwestern Saskatchewan. Tired of snow on September 29th.
Yeah, I hear that one. I think there's reason to expect an improvement. I think really most of the prairies took it on the chin last fall. We just had a really tough time in many areas getting the field work done because it got a little too cold too soon and too wet. And the interesting thing, we have a La Nina that is probably going to be evolving over this autumn. And La Nina events do tend to reduce some of the moisture available in the atmosphere, especially in the mid latitudes. So having a La Nina event developing in September or October can be really helpful in reducing some of the moisture availability in the atmosphere. So that's number one. Number two, we talked about this ridge of high pressure. The ridge of high pressure that we get in July is expected as we go into August to kind of retrograde and shift back to the west a little bit. That'll put that ridge more over western Saskatchewan, the U.S. Rocky Mountains, and parts of Alberta. And so between La Nina and the ridge shifting to the west, we should have a drier, better autumn. And I think that is something we can almost count on, especially with the La Nina event coming on.
Okay, I'm with you on the 1966. I just looked up the top movies, Drew. Okay, are you ready for this? The
Yeah.
Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, man. El Dorado. Great movie with John Wayne. Fantastic. What else we got
right.
here? And the other ones I don't recognize. Two great Westerns. Absolutely amazing. Love that. Okay, what's with this hailstorm that went through? Like, Drew, it's the middle of June. I look at July as more of like the hail. Like, it hasn't been that humid. And like Calgary was just obliterated by hail and rain. What happened?
Yeah, it's a bad deal. That storm that came out of Montana, that event. What's interesting is that storm, under normal circumstances, would have moved from Montana to Manitoba, and everybody along that path and to the north would probably have gotten some nice rain. But that darn ridge showed up, and it pushed the storm straight north for a little while, and then it moved it northwest. And so a deepening low pressure system creeping up the front range of the Rockies, throwing all that cool air up against the mountains, created an environment where a lot of moisture was generated right off the bat. And the deepening low pressure system was pulling some of that warm air into the front quadrant, the southwest quadrant of the storm. And the air masses were just working together. You had the warm and dry, you had the cool and the wet, and they were coming together. And we just allowed the storm to really get very intense. And we ended up creating a supercell thunderstorm, the kind of thing we see down here in the States on a regular basis. And it just butt up against the mountains and was stuck there. And we ended up with crazy amounts of hail and damage. And it was a horrendous event. And as far as the time of the year, you can get that to happen almost any time you've got all those ingredients coming together. It is typical that we see that more in July because typically Canada doesn't heat up this quickly. Back in the olden days, of course, and in more recent years, we can heat up pretty quick. So we're getting more and more like the U.S. plains every year.
I saw somebody tweet. I have Montana on my shirt as I'm protesting the fact they sent us that storm. Uh, I saw a tweet after the storm, and I can't remember who sent it out, but they said it's concerning that we're getting storms from the south into parts of central Alberta. Is there anything to that, or is that just that's the way it was based on the scenario you just outlined?
Well, I think it's more of what I just said.
Okay.
I don't know it depends on what their perspective was when they tweeted that. If they were worried about more hailstorms, then that is a potential because you're going to bring other low pressure systems out of Montana and move them northward, especially if the ridge reasserts itself next month over the areas just to the east. So that is, it could certainly be a concern that we would see more of that if that kind of weather scenario plays out. Originally, we thought that the storms would be in Saskatchewan as we go forward through the summer. But with the ridge scenario starting to come together, that it will be shifted farther to the west. So Alberta should be at least aware of the potential that we could see more of this wild weather. And I think there was that same weekend, there was a crazy storm in the Humboldt area that worked up closer to, I think, Blaine Lake or just to the east of that. A little cluster of thunderstorms that produced 4 inches of rain and some crazy wind. I think a couple of bins were knocked over. So, I mean, it's happening in more than just a couple of locations.
For growers in Eastern Canada, where should they be looking to in terms of buildups and patterns of weather systems that influence their future weather?
I think their weather is going to be a byproduct of what happens in central North America. If we end up with a stronger ridge evolving as we go into the second half of the summer or the middle of the summer, then if the ridge is strong enough, it's going to force a lot of cooler air southward from the eastern portions of Canada. So that cold air would come down through eastern parts of Ontario and into Quebec. And so we would have shots of cooler air, and because you're on the front side of the ridge, there wouldn't be a lot of contrasting air mass temperatures. So you would end up with a little bit of a mild scenario with drier bias conditions. Now, the only catch for those areas in Quebec and Ontario is the active tropical cyclone season that we expect this year. The Atlantic and the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico are all poised for a very active tropical season. We've already seen that. We had 3 storms. We had 2 storms before the season even started.
Yeah. And
now we're taking a little break right now, but it'll be back, and it'll be back with a vengeance. And so the storms later in this year are going to come right up the Atlantic coast. And so there'll be potential for that to have influence, obviously, on Quebec and some of the maritime provinces there. So there's potential that we will end up with more moisture in there from a tropical system or two. But if you take that out of the picture, it's all about a northwest flow and a relatively dry, biased environment.
Are you predicting a vicious hurricane season this year?
I do think that we're going to have a pretty interesting year, yes. I think we've got officially 17 storms coming in our forecast, 9 hurricanes. I think there'll be 3 major hurricanes. And it looks like the lower east U.S. coast is probably going to see a lot of those storms, at least threaten, if not move, inland. So it kind of reminisces a little bit of 2005. When we had multiple storms move across Florida and impact some of the southeastern U.S. I'm not necessarily saying that's going to happen again. I'm just saying that the ingredients are there to generate frequent storms, a few of which are going to be very large, and there will be more of a threat in the U.S. Atlantic coastal area.
From a weather forecast perspective, if you divide the Corn Belt in half, are you more optimistic about the weather that the Western Belt's going to have or the Eastern Belt?
The Eastern Belt for right now will probably have a little bit better weather, mainly because it will not be subjected to the heat as persistently as the West will. If we get that ridge building in the middle of the North American continent, then the Western Corn Belt will certainly be more vulnerable to hotter temperatures. And that's always the case anyway, because they're a little bit closer to the arid areas in the plains. So if you put a ridge in the middle of that region, you obviously raise that potential. So hotter, drier, biased conditions in places like Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, that's probable, I think. We may dry out the eastern Midwest, but we won't get them as hot. And so they'll be able to manage the drier bias a little better because their soil moisture will be conserved for a longer period of time.
Now, earlier Jim asked a question about fall and harvest and being sick of snow in middle of September. Last year in eastern Canada, we saved that corn crop because we had such a beautiful September. What are you seeing out into the fall for the eastern side of Canada?
Yeah, my biggest concern about them is this tropical cyclone season that we were just talking about. The most active time period for the Atlantic coast of North America is in September. And so we can get some pretty vicious storms going up the coast, and we can wrap a lot of moisture around into Ontario and Quebec. So that's the biggest risk that I see. If we can keep the tropical systems out of the neighborhood, then we will be able to finish out with a relatively good, normalish looking autumn season with a tendency for maybe temperatures to get a little cool a little early. That would be the only thing that I would be a little concerned about. But if you have active tropical cyclones, you bring that warm, moist air up from the Atlantic, and you would actually generate a temporary area of ridginess, and that would actually create a little bit of heat. So if you don't have the tropical systems, a little cooler and a drier bias. If you have the tropical systems, you're going to have a lot of rain to deal with. But the good thing about tropical systems is they just come and go, right? They don't just hang on for weeks at a time. So if we get one that comes up, or two or three that do produce a lot of moisture into Quebec and Ontario, it's probably not going to last for a long period of time. And we'll just have to keep our fingers crossed that we don't end up with so much rain we have, serious flooding to deal with. But that's the only thing that I can see at the moment.
Okay, I think Jim's trying to book a holiday. He wants to know about weather in the Mediterranean, Europe, and North Africa. What about India? So I think he's looking to book a holiday. Or no, maybe that's just those are countries we compete with in certain crops.
Yeah. Well, those are good questions. Let's see. Today, as of this point in time in Europe, we still have some dryness occurring in parts of France and Germany and the UK. Now, this dryness is not what it was a few weeks ago. We had some real serious dryness going on for a while, and that went away. We started getting some scattered showers. It's been very erratic rains, not the best. So the bottom line is that some areas have experienced better conditions and others have really not. And we're going back under the ridge for them. A new ridge of high pressure will build up over this next 10-day period, so that will dry them out again. Since they're already still carrying a little bit of moisture deficit, that might make France and Germany maybe a little bit drier than they want for a period of time. This is not a pattern, though, that will persist through the entire summer. It should break down after about 10 days. We should go back into an active weather pattern. The bottom line is most of Western Europe will do okay. In Eastern Europe, a huge improvement there. It was way too dry this spring. And last fall, and they didn't get all the crops in the ground and all kinds of issues. But it started raining here several weeks ago, and it's become very wet there. So the bottom line, they've seen a lot of improvement, and the moisture profile is very good. So most of Eastern Europe, like the Balkan countries into parts of Ukraine, I think they're poised to do fairly well.
Well, that's not good. That hurts our wheat, Drew.
I know. Well, hang on. I'm not done yet.
Okay, go ahead.
We do have some issues evolving right now in eastern Ukraine, and from there over into Russia's southern region. And now there's a lot of winter wheat that's produced there. That crop is getting pretty far advanced, so we're probably not going to do a lot of damage to it. But we could impact their soybeans or their sunseed crop. There's going to be a frost and freeze coming up in the eastern Russia new lands here Thursday and Friday. Maybe we can fry some of your sunseed for you and maybe help the canola market. Okay, does that make you feel any better?
Yeah.
So, and as far as India is concerned, unfortunately, I don't have any good news for prices because India's monsoon is off to a wonderful start and it's going to have a really active year. There's going to be plenty of moisture around. The only thing you can hope for, Shaun, is that maybe they would get so much rain that they flood all of their pulse crops and the oil seeds, and that we end up profiting that. But that's the only thing I can come up with right now, and I don't really think that's going to be the case.
Okay, well, hey, that's good stuff. Jim now has his update on where he can book his holiday. Okay, Krista asks, will La Nina persist into winter for Canadian prairies?
Yes. I think there's a really good chance that this La Nina will either be fully evolved by winter or it will be in the process of doing so. And just having La Nina around does make us a little colder biased. Now, unfortunately, that's not real good news after last year's brutal cold that we had for a little while. But yeah, La Nina does tend to reinforce that. There's a couple other things going on too that might help to reinforce some of that cold. First of all, if you get a La Nina that's persistent, you tend to generate what we call the negative phase of Arctic oscillation. And that's how you get a lot of cold air to come out of the Arctic once in a while. The two kind of work together sometimes. In addition to that, there's something really off the wall called the quasi-biannual oscillation, or QBO. It has nothing to do with anything that occurs in North America. It's actually over the tropical regions, the equatorial regions of the world, and it has to do with upper level winds. And there's a warm phase and a cool phase. All you really need to know is that the QBO is going to be in its negative phase. And when we have negative phase QBO and La Nina and negative AO playing out at the same time, the winters can be really nasty cold. And it would not only impact Canada, but parts of the U.S. as well. Now, I haven't done all my homework, so you can't hold me to this completely.
Okay.
I still need to look at the 18-year cycle stuff and all that, and I've been too busy with summer weather to deal with that quite yet. But if I had to put money on the table right now, I would say probably be a colder winter for the prairies, yes.
As long as that, Krista says, sorry she asked. Okay, but as long as that cold winter does not come early, like let us get done harvest, Drew. I think that's the big, because we've experienced so much of that in the past 4 years, like you alluded to, in parts of the Western Canada.
Yeah, and I don't think you have to worry about that too much, because one of the anomalies that come with La Nina is a tendency for a warm autumn. The early part of the autumn season tends to be warm. That's September and early part of October. When we get the cold, it's usually November, December, January, February. And so I don't think you have to worry about that too much right now.
Hey, final question, and we're running out of time here. Jim is getting one last one in. He says, last question, I promise. Sunspots.
Oh, now, how can we do that in just a few minutes? What does you want to know about sunspots?
I don't know. It just says sunspots ?
All right. Well, we can just about do anything we want, I guess.
Yeah, it's all yours, buddy.
Yeah, we're in a solar minimum. That usually means that the sunspot numbers are at a low. There's an 11-year cycle, from the minimum to the minimum. So we're at the minimum of a solar cycle. So what does that mean? The thing that the solar cycle does best is when we're at the minimum, we do get some more cooler air around at times in the eastern part of North America in the second half of summer. Excuse me. The benefit from that, of course, would be taking the edge of the heat down by a notch or two for places like Ontario and Quebec and down into the U.S. Midwest. But it's one of those deals where the year before the solar minimum, the relationship is much better. When you're coming in the year following the minimum or you're coming out of the minimum, it tends not to work as well. And sometimes we can go the other way and we end up warm biased. So because the solar minimum has officially occurred, I believe, in the last few weeks, we probably have to assume we're coming out of it at this point. And so the end result will we probably won't have a great deal of influence from it. Now, the solar cycle does all kinds of other things, so we don't have enough time to really go into all that right now. We'll save that maybe for another time. But the solar cycle certainly does have influence on a lot of things. One of the things that it does for the U.S. is it tends to make July warmer biased, and that's exactly what we're looking at. And we went back and did a study on solar cycle correlations with the U.S. crop area in particular, and we took all the solar minimums going back to, I think it was the 1930s. And we just ran a composite. And what we found was there was a tendency for the central part of the U.S. to be warmer than normal and drier than normal in those summers. And we got that on top of this potential ridge coming up. And that's one of the reasons why our official forecast for North America has included a tendency for the U.S. Midwest to be a lot drier this year than any of the last 2 years that we've seen. So we're going to have to watch that and see what happens.
Good stuff. Hey, I'm going to slip one more in here, Drew, okay? One more. You may have already kind of covered it, but Kevin wants to know, he's based in Saskatchewan. He wants to know, what is the hail forecast for the prairies? Do you see more hailstorms?
I think that the hail situation is going to be rather significant in the west part of the prairies, and not all the way into western Alberta. This would be really what we could do from, I guess Calgary, from Calgary over towards Lloydminster, up towards Blaine Lake, and over to Prince Albert, and then coming back down towards the States, maybe passing through Regina, Moose Jaw area, coming down to maybe the Williston, North Dakota area. And that big area I just described would probably have a little bit more vulnerability to severe weather than areas farther to the east. And that's assuming that the ridge is going to set up where I think it will be, running from the U.S. plains north into a part of Saskatchewan, eastern Saskatchewan and Manitoba. If the ridge is a little farther to the west, or to the east, and a little bit lower amplitude, then we could see that severe weather occur right across parts of Manitoba and eastern Saskatchewan, and we would actually reduce the risk for southern Alberta and western Saskatchewan. So it really depends. Everything depends on this ridge, right? It's all about the ridge this year. So if the ridge is weak, we'll look for the severe weather to be more Saskatchewan, Manitoba. If it's strong, it'll be more Alberta, western Saskatchewan.
Well, Kansas City may not have baseball this summer, but they got one of the best weather forecasters in the business. Drew, this has been so much fun. I really appreciate it. If somebody wants to become a subscriber to World Weather Inc., how do they do so?
Well, they can go to our website, www.worldweather.cc. Please don't go to .com. That's not us, and we don't want you there. But weather.cc. And then you can, of course, Twitter us. You can send a note through Twitter. And you can also reach us at World Weather. At the email address is worldweather@bizkc.rr.com. Just go to our website. All that information is on there, phone number and all that stuff. But please subscribe. We want your business, want your money.
Well, you know what Kevin just said? Subscription is worth every penny. That's a good endorsement right there, Drew, from Kevin Elmy, who just asked our last question. So great stuff. And if you can't get a hold of Drew, email me, shaney@realagriculture.com, and I'll get the two of you set up. Really appreciate it, Drew. Drew Lerner, World Weather Inc. Awesome stuff, Drew. Thanks a lot, bud.
All right, you guys take care. Have a great summer.